Now that we've seen the use of a variable and some basic naming conventions of what to do and not to do, let's look at a little bit in more details what a data type is associated with a variable. That means what kind of data will that variable store. So let's start from scratch again. So let me just delete all this, okay? And let's create a variable and name it num1. So you're assuming this is going to hold some sort of a number. Okay, well, let's assign it a value. And let's give it what we call an integer, which is a whole number. Okay, so that could be a positive 5, negative 5, any value that is whole with no decimal points. Okay, so this will be an integer. So if you want to write a comment next to it, that's called an integer. So let me just spell it better. Integer, there, right? An integer, again, is a whole number, all right? So how about a float? A float will have a decimal point. So num2, for example, unlike num1, will have something like this, 5.5. Now that would be a float, okay? So we're holding a float value there. What else can we do? What I've showed you another one, which is a complex number, right? So it has a real part and an imaginary part. So let's call it num3, which is really a composite of a real and imaginary components, complex. And notice as I'm typing, the IDE is trying to help me. It's trying to suggest what you would want. And I want the built-in complex. That's what I want. Okay. Now some IDEs might have this, some IDEs may not. So just be aware of it. So when you're dealing with a complex number, you have the real component, which will be the first argument of this. Let's say it's a -1, comma, and the second argument is the imaginary side, 7. Okay. Now let's go ahead and try to print out what we've stored in memory. So we've done this before, so print, you could say num1, you could see how it will print that. So let's go ahead and play with that. And you could see here the 5 appears, and let's go ahead and do print num2. And we get to see that it will print with the decimal point right there. Okay, and let's go ahead and try to print num3. Now, things get interesting here. So if I do a print num3 as is, let's see what happens. Okay, you could see here that it will print it in its rectangular form. So -1 is the real part plus 7j, where 7 is the imaginary. Now, let's suppose you wanted to print the particular, just the real part separately, and then you want to print the imaginary part separately. You could do that. So, and this is the beauty about Python that you might not find in other languages. num3 has some features. So let's see where they are. Print num3. So instead of just saying print num3, I'm going to put a dot here. And you can see here right away, I have two components here. I can print its imaginary side. I can print its real side, okay? So I want to print its real side. And I'm just going to double click here. So as you can see, the IDE is helping me with suggestions. So out of this -1 plus 7j, I want just the -1 to print here. So let's see what happens. And there you have it. And notice, even though I entered these as if they are integers, but with complex, it assumes they're floats. So watch that 1.0. So it actually assumes that. All right, so that's an observation that you may want to keep in mind. And let's go ahead and print the imaginary side of this. Print num3 and the imaginary side of that complex number. And if we run this, there you have it. So you get that 7.0 again as a float. So Interesting observations, right? It has converted those integers to floats. Okay, from a magnitude point of view, they're the same values. All right, so we've seen an integer float. How about other type of variables? We've seen something that holds a string, name, and I'll put my name here. Okay, and if I do a print name, so I'm dereferencing that variable, you can see that it does that. Now, something interesting about strings, I can do a few more things. A string, it really is a collection of characters stored in an array. So that means I can go to a specific location within that array and print each character if I wanted to. And which means, just like a book, each letter is in a page by itself. So what page is D? It's page 0, page 1, page 2, page 3. Okay, so can I print each page or each content of the page? Sure. So let's go ahead and do this. Print name, and I'm going to put a bracket here. And bracket means I'm going to put an index in it, or a page number, page 0. Let's see what happens. And notice I get a D. Okay, well, let's repeat this command here. Let me just copy it. And let's go ahead and paste it here. And put 1. Let's see what happens. And I get the R. Okay, so if I do this and I go beyond the scope, or how many do we have? So if we start here at 0, 1, 2, 3, and if I try to print 5 or 6, we're going to have a problem. So let's go ahead and put 6, okay? And I want you to experiment with this and see what kind of issues you're going to run into. And there you have it. We did get an error right here, and it says string index out of range. So we're not within that range. So let's take that out. We know this is an error. Or if you don't want to take it out, just put a pound sign in front of it. It becomes a comment. Okay? And you could say this is invalid. Right? So, right. Okay, so now what else? Can we have a variable that stores a single character? Well, you could do something like this, my char, so you can, and then you could put a single character as a string, right? So T. And you could do it that way technically. And so if we print my char, and let's print it, and there you get your T. Now, if that's the case, then I can also reference to it as index 0. So let's go ahead and do index 0, because technically it's a string. So, and there you have it. Okay. Now let's leave it that way. Let me just do my char, and let's go ahead and do print my char 0, so we could see that it is actually a string, right? So it only has one page. So let's go ahead and do this here. So we get T and T. Now let's do this now. My char 2, right? So it's second character. And I'm going to store in it the letter P. But notice now I'm using a single quote, right? So let's go ahead and try to print that. So print my char 2, and that should just print just fine. And there you get it. And let me just scroll here so you can see there are no errors. Now, what if I try, okay, and let's copy this and paste it here and put index 0 as if it's an array. Let's see what happens. And let's see if we got any errors. Nope, it doesn't see it, so it sees it as simply the same way we've done it right here. So you put single quotes or two quotes. That didn't make any difference, and we're good to go. So it really is internally an array. So it accepted the index, okay? Even though we used single quotes. So just keep that in mind. Keep it in your notes in terms of the characteristics or the behavior of what goes on between this kind of notation versus this kind of notation. So now we've seen how to declare and assign a value. So these are all initialized in the program. This is what we call compile time, even though we're not really compiling here, we're interpreting variables. So in our next video, we're going to look at how do we assign values to these variables while the program is running. So as you can see here, these variables were assigned values in the code itself. What if we wanted to interact with this program? Okay, so that will be our next video. I will see you then.